She sat the cold sandwich in front of him and walked away like he wasn't even there. Not once did she say his name. Not once did she check back. Everyone else got wine, warmth, and respect. He stayed quiet the entire flight. But the moment they landed, her entire career began to fall apart. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next one. Avery Knox stepped into the first-class cabin of Flight 332 with calm steps and a quiet presence. He didn't wear his power like a badge, just a smooth gray blazer, pressed black slacks, and a leather carry-on marked with his initials, AK. His silver-framed glasses sat neatly on his face, and he nodded politely to the flight attendant at the door. She gave a stiff smile and turned to greet the man behind him with a cheerful, "Welcome aboard, Mr. Drayton." Avery said nothing. He had seen this before. He moved to his seat, 2A, placed his bag in the overhead compartment, and sat down. The cabin smelled of leather and lemon polish. The champagne carts clinked in the background, and voices floated through the air like light conversation at a country club. Avery sat still. He'd taken this airline dozens of times. He was a Diamond Elite member, flown more than anyone in that cabin. He didn't expect special treatment, but he expected what he'd earned. When a young attendant passed through the aisle with a tray of warm towels, she paused in front of 1C, then 1D, then skipped 2A entirely. Avery watched but didn't react. The couple beside him accepted theirs with a laugh and a thanks. The warmth of the cabin seemed to pull away from him, one small gesture at a time. He looked out the window as the plane began to taxi. His seat reclined without a sound. The night was long, the flight would be longer, and something told him this wasn't going to be the flight he booked. The plane lifted off the runway with a low rumble, and the lights inside the cabin dimmed to a soft gold. Avery Knox reached for the small button beside his seat and adjusted his reading lamp. He didn't open a book. He just sat still, letting the silence settle around him. Across the aisle, the woman in 2C was already sipping her champagne. The man beside her had loosened his tie and was asking about the Bordeaux. A few minutes later, Jordan Hale appeared. She wore a perfect navy uniform and a pinched smile that didn't reach her eyes. She stopped at 1A and greeted the older white man by name, complimenting his tie. Then she turned to the next row. "Mr. and Mrs. Hargrove, would you care for the 2009 Cabernet or the Sparkling?" she asked. Her tone was warm and confident. She offered full glasses, even recommended the best pairings for their meal. Then she walked past 2A without stopping. Avery blinked once and kept his hands folded in his lap. He wasn't surprised. He had pre-ordered his meal 6 days ago, like always. Seared halibut, saffron rice, and a pear tart. The same order he had made for the last 5 years on this route. He looked ahead. A faint line of condensation ran down the window. When Jordan returned again, her tray was almost empty. She paused beside him for the first time. "Sorry, Mr. Knox," she said, eyes not quite meeting his. "Your meal isn't available tonight. Something must have gone wrong in the system." She held out a tray with a cold ham sandwich wrapped in plastic and a bottle of water that hadn't been chilled. "That's all we've got left." Avery looked at the tray for a moment. Then he met her eyes. "I received confirmation," he said plainly. Jordan nodded once, not offering a reply. "It happens sometimes," she said, already stepping away. The sandwich stayed on the tray in front of him, untouched. Avery Knox didn't move. The tray sat on the small table in front of him like an unwanted reminder. The sandwich looked limp, its edges curling slightly under the plastic wrap. The bottle of water had no condensation, no chill, as if it had been pulled from the back of a storage bin. He kept his hands in his lap, fingers interlocked, the way he had learned to do in rooms where silence said more than anger ever could. Across the aisle, the white couple in 2C and 2D were being served their starters on fine china. Warm bread in a linen roll, butter in a tiny silver dish. Laughter drifted from their seats, quiet but full of ease. Avery didn't look at them. He looked straight ahead, A soft ding rang out as the captain announced the altitude and weather, but it faded into the background. He could feel the weight of the sandwich tray in front of him. Not physical, but something else. Something heavier. Jordan Hale passed him again a few minutes later, pushing a cart of desserts. She stopped at 1C. "Would you like the caramel tart or the chocolate mousse, Mr. Benwick?" Her voice had a lightness to it. Polite, familiar, warm. Avery listened to the sound of the cart rolling past him. It didn't slow, it didn't stop. His dessert wasn't offered, not even acknowledged. He turned slightly toward the window, but not to look outside. He was thinking, not about the food. Not really. The food was just the signal. A small, silent message sent out like an old habit. Not important, not priority, not one of us. That's what the sandwich said. That's what the warm tone for others and cold professionalism for him confirmed. He remembered sitting in a boardroom 15 years earlier, being mistaken for the driver by a young junior partner who was too embarrassed to apologize. That memory used to sting. Now, it just reminded him how far he had come, and how little had changed in some places. Avery glanced down at the sandwich again, still untouched, still quiet, like him. But he wasn't a man who stayed quiet for long, not when it counted. Avery Knox sat back in his seat and closed his eyes for a moment. Not to sleep, just to pull inward. The tray table remained down, the sandwich untouched, the bottle of water sweating slightly now as the cabin temperature changed. A faint hum from the engine filled the space between everything, between his thoughts, between the laughter 2 rows ahead, and between the silence wrapped around him like a second skin. He wasn't new to this. He had built his entire life learning how to sit still while the world measured him quietly. He knew the difference between an accident and a pattern. He knew the weight behind polite smiles and the truth behind a shrug. That sandwich wasn't a mistake. It was a message. A quiet one, maybe even unintentional, but still a message. Avery had learned long ago that prejudice didn't always come with raised voices or cruel words. Sometimes it came with soft tones and small choices. The wrong meal, the skipped greeting, the missed name. A pattern of small cuts, never deep enough to bleed, but always enough to leave a mark. He shifted in his seat slightly, stretching one leg. His knee cracked softly. 57 years old. Most of those years spent working 10 times harder than anyone else in the room just to be seen as equal. He hadn't grown bitter. He had grown sharp, watchful. He had learned to read the room, the faces, the tone of a sentence, the lift of a brow. Across the aisle, Jordan leaned down to refill wine for the couple in 2C. She laughed at something the man said, genuine laughter, the kind that softened a face. Then she looked in Avery's direction. Their eyes met for just a second. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She looked away as if nothing had passed between them. But something had. And Avery knew it. He turned his head slowly and looked down at the slim tablet in his lap. It had gone dark. He tapped it once and the screen lit up again. The welcome page of his firm's internal operations panel appeared. A navy blue screen. Silver letters. He swiped once, paused, then tapped into the secure access side. There, in a separate folder labeled Oversight Protocol, was the airline crew ID database, information shared with their aviation ethics compliance partners. He wasn't planning to act. Not yet. But he wasn't planning to forget either. He stared at the screen, his finger hovering above the menu, and then slowly tapped it shut. Now wasn't the moment. Not while the air was still quiet. Not while the plane was still cruising steady at 35,000 feet. He folded his hands again, resting them in his lap. The flight attendant walked by once more without looking his way. And that was when Avery made the decision. It wasn't about food. It never had been. It was about being seen. Or not. It was about how easy it still was to make someone like him feel like they didn't quite belong, unless they forced the world to remember. And Avery Knox had never liked being forgotten. The cabin dimmed further as the flight moved into its mid-phase. A warm orange glow ran along the ceiling, trying to mimic sunset. though outside it was already pitch black. The hum of the engines mixed with the low murmur of conversation and the occasional clink of glassware. A few passengers had reclined their seats, tucked under gray wool blankets. It looked peaceful. For some, it probably was. Avery Knox stayed upright. He hadn't touched the tray in front of him. The sandwich had started to dry out at the edges. The plastic wrap now fogged from the shift in temperature. It sat there like an insult no one had spoken aloud, waiting to see how long he'd tolerate it. He shifted slightly, not in discomfort, but in quiet tension. The kind that builds when dignity is pressed, not shattered. When a man is not yelled at, but instead simply made invisible. That kind of insult wasn't loud. It was careful, casual. The kind that left you wondering just for a moment if maybe you were overthinking it, if maybe the system did glitch, if maybe the mistake wasn't personal. But then you remember your name, your record, your titles, your years of flying first class not for pleasure but for work, for strategy, for leadership. You remember being loyal to this airline for 2 decades. You remember the confirmation email, the booking reference, the repeated reminders that your preference had been logged. You remember the way Jordan Hale smiled as she poured a second glass of vintage Pinot for the man in 1C. You remember how she addressed each white passenger by name, remembered their wine, laughed at their jokes, bent slightly lower when speaking to them. And then you remember how she said, "Sorry, Mr. Knox," without a trace of warmth. No apology. No offer of an alternative, just a sandwich, wrapped, cold. He reached for his glass of water. It was lukewarm now. He sipped, not because he was thirsty, but to do something with his hands. The water tasted flat, the kind you expect in a waiting room, not first class. He leaned back slightly. A quiet sigh left him, not dramatic, not defeated, but long, the sigh of someone who had held too many things in for too long, who had learned to sit still in rooms where others were free to stretch. Avery glanced to his left toward the aisle. Jordan passed again, smiling at a woman now asking for chamomile tea. Avery waited. Her eyes didn't meet his. Her steps didn't slow. She walked by like he wasn't there. Like seat 2A had no occupant at all. And that's when something small, something quiet, moved in him. He didn't feel angry. He felt certain. Avery opened the tablet again, entered a second password. The screen unlocked into a private network. He tapped into a protocol most people didn't even know existed. It wasn't public. It wasn't noisy. It wasn't the kind of thing you used unless you were sure. He read the names of the flight crew: Jordan Hale, Marcus Linton, Drew Taylor, each with a service ID, each linked to data stored through partner systems for ethics compliance, logged quietly with every mile they flew. He didn't type anything yet. He just stared at her name, Jordan Hale. 5 years with the airline, no formal complaints on record. But that meant very little. The system was designed to hide what it couldn't prove quickly, what it called subjective, behavior, tone, consistency. But Avery knew better. Patterns always left prints. He moved his finger slightly, hovered above the flag for audit option, then stopped. He closed the tablet. Not now. The justice he wanted wasn't about the sandwich. It was about something older, something deeper. The worn-down feeling that followed people like him into every high room. The feeling of knowing he had earned everything, the seat, the loyalty, the quiet respect, and still being treated like an accident in the wrong place. And in that moment, Avery Knox decided, this wouldn't be forgotten. Not this time. The flight wore on. Outside the window there was nothing but night, dark and endless. No stars, no city lights. Just black sky pressing against cold glass. Avery Knox stared through it, not seeing anything. His reflection faintly looked back at him, barely there, as if the cabin lights couldn't decide whether to let him be visible or not. He sat still, always still. That was something he'd learned from years of being the only black man in too many boardrooms. Stillness could protect. Stillness could wait. His body didn't ache, but something else did. Something heavier. There were times over the years when Avery had told himself he didn't need to react to every slight, that not every bad look, not every delay, not every skipped name meant something deeper. He'd built a company by choosing his battles with surgical care. He had walked into government buildings, defense summits, and billion-dollar talks knowing full well that being calm was not just a choice, it was survival. But he wasn't 28 anymore, and this wasn't his first time. He looked down at the tray again. That damn sandwich. It had collapsed slightly now. One corner pressed into the plastic, as if it had given up trying to hold itself together. The sight made something in him harden. Why did it bother him so much? It wasn't about the food. Of course it wasn't. He could afford 1,000 steak dinners. But it was the assumption behind it. That someone like him wouldn't matter, wouldn't notice, wouldn't say anything. That someone could take away something promised, confirmed, paid for, earned, and hand him something half-frozen and think it was good enough. He pressed his thumb and middle finger together slowly, the way he did when he needed to refocus. His father used to do that, sitting at the kitchen table after a 12-hour shift at the refinery, wiping his hands with a rough cloth, pausing before he said anything. Avery had learned that pause. It was where the real power lived. A rustle behind him pulled his attention for a second. One of the attendants, the male one, was chatting with a man in 3A about real estate in Colorado. They both laughed loudly. The attendant clapped the passenger lightly on the shoulder. Avery turned his head just enough to see it. That small touch of warmth, familiarity, relaxation, all exchanged in seconds. He had never received that. He didn't want fake kindness. He didn't want his ego stroked. What he wanted, what he always wanted, was to be treated without calculation, without someone scanning his skin before deciding what level of service to provide. He leaned forward now, slow and steady, and reached for the tablet again. The screen glowed up into his face like a quiet truth. He entered the encrypted channel again. This time he typed one line, not a complaint, just a ping to his assistant. Naomi, Flight 332, start a quiet flag on service experience. Attach crew log, wait for my next input. He stared at the message for a few seconds, letting it breathe. Then he pressed send. Avery sat back. He didn't feel better. He didn't feel powerful. He just felt clear. The kind of clarity that comes after years of watching, years of giving people the benefit of the doubt, and knowing exactly what it meant when it kept happening. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't caused a scene, hadn't even touched the sandwich. But something had started, and he wasn't going to stop it. Far below the cruising altitude, the earth rolled on unseen. Cities passed under the plane's shadow without acknowledgement, their lights blurred by clouds and distance. Inside the first-class cabin, the air was still, padded by soft murmurs and the occasional clicking of ice in crystal glasses. Flight 332 felt like a bubble, quiet, glossy, and suspended above consequence. Avery Knox didn't feel suspended. He felt grounded in a very specific way, the kind that came not from comfort, but from restraint. He watched the cabin like a man studying something familiar, not because it interested him, but because it never stopped repeating itself. He shifted slightly in his seat and glanced again at Jordan Hale as she stopped 2 rows ahead. She crouched next to a passenger, elbows on the armrest, speaking in a lowered, warm voice that gave the illusion of privacy. The passenger, a young man with expensive headphones and a Rolex half hidden by his sleeve, smiled, as if he'd just received news meant only for people like him. Jordan touched his shoulder briefly before rising. She was effortless with him, comfortable. That subtle intimacy born of habit. Avery's eyes stayed with her a second longer than usual, then returned to the tray in front of him. The sandwich had shifted slightly with turbulence. The bottle of water rolled gently into his forearm. He moved it aside with 2 fingers, the contact so light it felt surgical. Then he looked at the sandwich, not to eat it, not even with contempt. He studied it the way a man might study a photograph of something unpleasant from a past he'd rather not revisit but needed to. Because this was the past. It always was. He could recall, too clearly, a hotel lobby in Munich, year 4 of his company. He was traveling on a tight schedule, meetings back-to-back with EU cybersecurity firms. He arrived early to a client dinner, alone. 3 employees from the partner firm saw him waiting and asked him to fetch them water. They assumed he worked there. He had laughed it off. Later, when he signed the partnership, none of them met his eyes. That had been 15 years ago. He could still feel it. He had learned over time not to collect these stories like trophies of pain. That was exhausting. Instead, he filed them like data. Markers, patterns, confirmations. And tonight, Seat 2A was giving him confirmation all over again. He opened the tablet again. No hesitation this time. The screen was already unlocked, Naomi's earlier confirmation blinking at the top. Service flag acknowledged. Crew log accessed, awaiting further input. He could picture her, Naomi Reyes, sitting at a desk with her sleeves rolled up, glasses slightly crooked from hours of work. She never asked unnecessary questions. She didn't need to. Avery only spoke when it mattered, and when he did, Naomi understood. That was why he kept her close. He typed 3 more words. Begin soft trace. No names, no accusations, not yet. But the system was now active. The audit protocol was discreet. It monitored without alarm. Logged interactions, tracked patterns, partnered with compliance systems built into every major airline Avery's company contracted with. The power wasn't in the confrontation. It was in the quiet trail it left behind. He leaned back again. The hum of the cabin returned to the front of his mind. Jordan Hale passed once more. No eye contact. Not even a glance this time. Just an empty tray in her hands, a blank expression on her face. Avery watched her walk away. Not with anger, with precision. He had the tools. He had the records. He had the right. What he didn't have, what he refused to accept, was this kind of erasure. The quiet kind, the practiced kind. The kind that kept happening only because men like him had grown too used to absorbing it without noise. Not tonight, not anymore. The lights in the cabin shifted again, dimming into a soft blue wash that signaled the approach of the night phase. Blankets were passed around. Overhead screens faded into a dull display of flight maps and estimated arrival times. Most passengers began to settle. Some slipped on headphones. Others stretched and reclined. The hum of the engines deepened, becoming the background rhythm of a long-haul flight. For many, this was the quiet part, the restful part. But not for Avery Knox. He remained upright, still dressed sharply, still untouched by the comforts being offered to others without thought. His jacket was buttoned, his shoes still polished, his tray table still down, the sandwich untouched. No one had asked to take it away. No one had checked in on him. It simply sat there, like it had been left for someone who didn't know better. His eyes stayed open, focused, not angry. Focused. He thought of something strange. His mother, decades ago, pressing the hem of his church shirt under a hot iron, repeating the same sentence over and over like a quiet song. If they try to cut you down, make sure your collar is sharper than their words. At the time, he hadn't understood what she meant. Now, sitting in first class with his shoulders square and his dignity silently tested, he did. Avery's collar was sharp. His entire presence was. But even sharpness didn't always stop the blade that came from assumption. He reached for the tablet again, slower this time. He opened a folder marked Live Oversight Tools. Inside were layers of systems, dashboards his firm had helped design for clients in finance, healthcare, and aerospace. Hidden tracking tools built for transparency. He had given these tools to companies promising better ethics, but tonight he was using one for himself. He selected a tag labeled Crew Activity Log, Flight 332. A grid loaded, no names, just timestamps and behavior markers. It tracked where each flight attendant spent their time, which rows they lingered in, how long they spoke to each passenger. Jordan Hale's ID popped up the most in rows 1 and 3. In his row, row 2, her time log was brief, less than a minute in total, 0 return visits. He stared at the numbers. There it was. The silence, now visible. No sound, no outrage, just patterns, just fact. He didn't know what bothered him more, that she had excluded him so deliberately, or that the others saw it and said nothing. The man across the aisle must have noticed. The couple beside him surely realized they'd been served hot meals and wine while he sat with a wrapped sandwich and water. But no one said anything. That was what always hurt more than the act itself, the way others let it happen. He closed the log. Outside, turbulence began to stir. The plane rattled lightly. The seatbelt signs blinked on with a soft ding. Avery didn't move. He felt steadier than the aircraft itself. He thought back to his assistant again, Naomi. She was likely 3 screens deep by now, pulling documents, compiling past service records, checking background scans on the crew. She knew how to work quietly, knew the pace Avery preferred. Slow, deliberate, undeniable. She wouldn't act without instruction, but she would prepare for it like it was already inevitable. And maybe it was. His eyes moved toward the curtain separating first class from business. He could see shadows moving behind it. The cabin crew was back there now, likely chatting, laughing softly over snacks, sipping leftover coffee. In that tucked-away space where passengers weren't meant to listen or watch, Avery knew the truth of the service industry lived. In those little breaks where people showed their real selves. He had spent years walking into those spaces in other buildings. Executive lounges, private meetings, strategy sessions, where people didn't expect a black man to show up in charge. And yet, he always did. Quietly. Fully. With evidence no one could refute. This moment, this sandwich, this flight, this woman with the forced smile and the dismissive shrug. It was no different. Avery looked down at his lap. The tablet screen had dimmed again. His reflection floated faintly in the glass. He tapped the screen back to life. The cursor blinked in an empty message window to Naomi. He placed his finger on the keys, then paused. No rush. When it hit, it would be clean. And it would be final. The seatbelt sign clicked off again with a soft chime. The plane had leveled out after a brief stretch of shaking air. Passengers began to stir. Some reached for blankets. Others adjusted their seats or made quiet conversation with seatmates. But Avery Knox stayed still. His hands rested lightly on the armrests, fingers folded in a way that looked relaxed but wasn't. His shoulders were set, not tense, not loose. He wore composure like armor, a learned stillness that had carried him through decades of rooms where too much expression was a liability. The tray table was still down. That cold, plastic-wrapped sandwich sat like a mirror of the night. Untouched, unacknowledged, unnecessary. The bottle of water had now collected a rim of condensation, a slow ring spreading on the white napkin beneath it. No one had come to collect it. No one had asked if he needed anything. Not even once. Avery turned his head slightly and scanned the cabin without looking like he was scanning. Years of business taught him how to observe without appearing to. His eyes passed over passengers sipping coffee, flipping pages of magazines, adjusting their reading lights. He watched Jordan Hale emerge from the curtain near the galley and make her way to row 1 again. She leaned down, said something quiet to one of the men in 1B, and he chuckled in response. Then, as if feeling eyes on her, she glanced toward row 2. Her gaze brushed Avery's for less than a second. Just a blink. And in that blink, something registered. Not guilt, not shame, but that cool, empty professionalism that said, "I'm aware and I still won't change a thing." She looked away. Avery sat back, blinking once, then shifted his gaze to the small screen on the seat back in front of him. A map showed the plane's progress, a slow crawl over the Midwest. 3 hours until landing in San Francisco. 3 hours was more than enough. He tapped the tablet on his lap again and opened the secure app. Naomi had already replied. Confirmed. Jordan Hale, senior cabin crew. 5 prior performance reviews. 2 flagged for service inconsistency. No formal discipline. Crew includes Marcus Linton, attendant, Drew Taylor, support crew. Would you like to proceed with full trace? Avery read it twice. The words weren't surprising. He didn't expect a spotless record. No one was spotless. But what he saw in between the lines, that was familiar. Inconsistency. That word always lingered. In his world, it was a euphemism, a way to describe biased behavior without accusing anyone outright. It gave cover. It let systems delay action until the pressure was too public to ignore. He had seen it in job performance files, in investment firm evaluations, in hiring panels where qualified black candidates were deemed not the right fit. It was always the same word: inconsistent. He took a long breath. He wasn't angry. Not the kind that rose hot and sharp. He was the kind of angry that cooled down into something more dangerous, thoughtful, organized, long-lasting. The kind that made systems shift because he didn't shout. He built pressure that couldn't be ignored. Avery began typing again. Yes, initiate full trace. Include service logs. Pull time-stamped behavior patterns from previous 3 flights. Start preliminary draft for formal submission under guest equity clause. Quiet mode only. No direct alerts. He paused before hitting send. Not because he doubted himself, but because he always weighed the impact. There were people who would call him petty for doing this. People who would say, "It's just a sandwich." That kind of small thinking didn't interest him. He didn't lead a billion-dollar aerospace firm by thinking small. He hit send. The response came back within 60 seconds. Understood. Processing has begun. We will notify you when the compliance case is built. All flagged behaviors will be preserved for record. Review at your discretion. ETA, 48 hours. That was it. Nothing loud, no confrontation, no raised voice in the aisle, no demand for apologies. He had learned years ago that loud justice faded fast. Quiet justice stayed permanent, documented, filed, acted upon. He leaned back slightly, his head pressing into the headrest. He closed his eyes for just a moment, letting the hum of the engine fill the space behind his ears. It wasn't over. Not yet. But it had started, and Avery Knox didn't begin things unless he intended to finish them. A soft announcement came over the intercom. They had just entered California airspace. The captain's voice was calm, clipped, professionally warm. He mentioned clear skies and an expected early arrival into San Francisco. In the background, the faint clatter of cups and cutlery resumed. The cabin lights brightened slightly, signaling the start of pre-landing service. But no one had spoken to Avery Knox. Not a word since that tray landed in front of him nearly 4 hours ago. He didn't mind the silence. He was used to silence. It had shaped much of his career. What he minded was being selectively forgotten in a space designed to serve, and seeing with precision how carefully that forgetting was done. He looked around the cabin again, letting his eyes rest momentarily on each crew member. Jordan Hale was now working her way back down the aisle, collecting empty glasses and resetting trays. Her movements were smooth, practiced. She laughed lightly with the passenger in 1A, then offered breath mints to 1B, speaking so softly it could be mistaken for affection. But when she reached row 2, she paused. Not beside him. Beside 2C, where the woman in the navy blazer asked for a second blanket. Avery watched Jordan nod quickly, offer one without hesitation, then move on again without looking his way. It was choreographed, almost elegant in how perfectly impersonal it had become. He felt something inside him tighten, not from anger but from recognition. This wasn't an isolated moment. It was part of a design, one that had been crafted carefully over time. A structure that allowed this kind of behavior to thrive without ever crossing the line into fireable offense. Jordan had done nothing wrong, and that's why it was so dangerous. The lines she walked, who she greeted by name, who she smiled at, who she gave attention to, who she ignored, weren't accidents. They were selections. He glanced down at the tablet again, resting in his lap like a quiet weapon. Naomi had updated the log. The crew's pattern data was now building across multiple flights. On Flight 297 to Dallas last month, Jordan had skipped greeting two middle-aged Hispanic passengers seated in premium. On Flight 181, she had no logged interactions with the Indian woman in 1D, despite serving surrounding passengers twice each. All of it noted, timed, compared, mapped. Bias wasn't always in words. Sometimes it was in who got checked on, who didn't, who received warmth, who didn't. Avery knew that data told stories people tried to hide, and this story was unfolding like a slow, steady line drawn with intention. His thumb hovered over the screen again. He could submit the data packet now, finalize the trace, notify the airline's internal ethics board, and initiate a senior-level compliance review. It would flag the entire crew's conduct, not just Jordan's, but every attendant who had walked by him without a glance, everyone who had handed him silence wrapped in thin smiles. If submitted tonight, the review would hit before noon tomorrow. He didn't press send yet. Instead, he stared out the window. Below them, the land had changed. Faint grids of orange and white light marked the distant outline of towns and highways. Everything looked so calm from up here, as if the world was simple, peaceful, as if people didn't make assumptions in lobbies, as if his name hadn't once been left off a hotel booking, because the receptionist thought he couldn't be that Mr. Knox. He thought of his first trip to California, when he was barely 30 and pitching a defense system no one believed a black man had designed. He remembered walking into that room full of older men, suits too tight around their pride, and watching them flinch when he said CEO. They hadn't even masked it. Now he was above them, literally, flying over the land they once said he didn't belong in. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. Not Jordan's. It was the other attendant, Drew Taylor, a younger man with kind eyes and unsure posture. He stood beside 2A, holding a tray of individually wrapped hot towels. "Would you like a towel, Mr. Knox?" he asked, voice quiet, maybe nervous. Avery paused, then nodded once. Drew handed him one carefully, not with pity, but something closer to awareness, as if he knew. Maybe not everything, but enough to recognize that something had gone wrong, and that Avery had been the one carrying it alone the entire flight. Avery unfolded the towel and held it in his hands. The heat soaked into his fingers. It was just cloth and steam, but it felt like something shifted. He nodded again, a slight, almost invisible gesture. Not gratitude, not forgiveness, just acknowledgement. Drew stepped away. Avery turned back to the screen. His thumb pressed the final key. Submit. No noise, no confrontation. Just one line, quietly sent through secure channels. In the galley, Jordan Hale was pouring tea. She smiled as she handed a cup to 3A. She had no idea what had just begun. The plane had begun its slow descent, but the mood inside the cabin hadn't changed. There was still that curated calm, the one luxury airlines worked hard to maintain, even when the truth was less graceful. Passengers shifted in their seats, pulling on jackets, straightening ties, checking their watches. The attendants moved like dancers in a routine they'd memorized years ago, collecting cups, folding blankets, murmuring reminders about tray tables and seatbacks. Everything about it looked practiced, polished. But for Avery Knox, there was no real comfort in the routine. Not now. He sat upright, watching the aisle without really watching. His eyes followed the small movements. A crew member adjusting a headrest, a passenger tugging their luggage closer, the faint click of a pen. Jordan Hale hadn't looked his way again. She had passed once more, gathering trays, but her hands never reached toward his. The untouched sandwich remained in front of him, now a little dented from the turbulence. No one asked about it. No one offered to remove it. It had become part of the scenery, and so had he. Avery reached for his towel, now cold, and refolded it slowly, methodically, as if the act gave him control over the atmosphere. He didn't look angry. He didn't breathe hard or shift in frustration. His restraint was the sharpest part of him. It always had been. That restraint had built his company, had earned him respect in rooms where his name had been spoken only after others. It was what allowed him to wait during mergers, to stay still while his competitors tripped over themselves trying to read him. That silence, that collected stillness, it made people underestimate him just long enough for him to own the room. But tonight the silence had been used against him, and he had let it go on long enough. His tablet pinged. A small green indicator flashed in the corner of the screen. Naomi. Submission received. Ethics flag processed. Behavioral compliance trace activated. Preliminary crew review will initiate immediately upon arrival. Report confirmed by partner systems. Video and audio capture stored. Internal memo will be triggered upon crew disembarkment. Avery read it slowly, then read it again. It was done. The moment the flight touched ground, everything behind that curtain, the careless remarks, the skipped courtesies, the cold dismissals masked as standard service, would begin to unfold under scrutiny. Not under his voice, not under his accusation, but under the rules the airline had promised to uphold. He hadn't made the rules, but he had made sure they were followed. The flight attendant who had never looked him in the eye would now be watched, not shouted at, not humiliated, but observed in the same quiet way she had once looked past him. And that, to Avery, was the only justice that mattered, the kind that mirrored the offense, precisely, efficiently, and without warning. He looked out the window again. The lights of San Francisco were beginning to flicker beneath them, a delicate grid of gold, stretching toward the Pacific. They were close now. Avery thought of his father again, of the way he once told him, "You don't have to bark to guard something. Sometimes you just stand still, and that's enough for people to back away." He had never forgotten those words. Behind him, passengers were beginning to stir more actively. The couple beside him started packing their reading materials. Overhead compartments clicked open. A light came on above 3B. The world was waking up again, pretending it had always been kind. And yet Avery knew better. Knew how much could hide in politeness. How easily cruelty could be wrapped in soft fabric and passed off as standard practice. Jordan Hale came down the aisle one last time. She was collecting trays now. She stopped at 2C and smiled. Then she glanced at 2A. For the first time all flight, her eyes met his for more than a second. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't warmth. It was the beginning of something else. Uncertainty. The look someone gives when they feel something they can't yet name, like when the ground shifts and you haven't realized it's an earthquake yet. "Will you be needing anything else, Mr. Knox?" she asked, the words slow, overly careful. Avery looked at her. His expression didn't shift. His voice was even. "No," he said. "I've already received everything I needed." Jordan's mouth moved slightly, as if to say something else. But she didn't. She simply nodded, took the untouched tray with the sandwich, and turned away. She didn't know those words would echo in a report sent to 4 different compliance officers within the hour. She didn't know the data attached to her name had already begun to move through systems she had never thought about. She didn't know her silence had finally been heard, because it had been recorded. As the plane began its final descent, Avery sat back, folded his hands, and closed his eyes. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't made a scene. But by the time that cabin door opened, the entire crew's world would begin to tilt, and not a single person would be able to say they hadn't seen it coming. The wheels struck the tarmac with a sharp, grounding jolt. Avery Knox didn't flinch. The force of the landing rippled through the cabin, a shared moment of brief silence before movement returned. Buckles clicked, bags shifted, phones lit up. Everyone around him seemed to lurch back into the world, stretching, yawning, tapping their screens, eager to be off the plane and into their evening. But Avery remained still, hands calmly folded, eyes open now and focused on the seat back in front of him. The screen displayed a soft message in gray text. "Welcome to San Francisco International Airport." Below it, the logo of the airline, a sleek silver emblem, blinked slowly as if it had no idea what had just occurred at 35,000 feet. He waited. He always waited. Behind him, a businessman was already on the phone, speaking in a low voice about a car service delay. The woman across the aisle was digging through her tote bag, fishing for gum and hand lotion. Jordan Hale stood at the front of the cabin with her practiced posture and clipped smile, thanking passengers as they prepared to deplane. She still looked sure of herself, still moved with that quiet, unchecked confidence, the kind that came from knowing the system was always on her side, the kind that was taught, even if never spoken aloud, that some people get the benefit of the doubt without having to earn it. But that confidence had a crack in it now. Just one. Small, but growing. Avery stood slowly, letting the moment stretch. He reached for his bag in the overhead bin with a practiced hand, careful not to rush, not to disturb the air around him. He didn't need to. The power he carried didn't live in how fast he moved. It lived in how completely he refused to shrink. He adjusted the strap over his shoulder and stepped into the aisle. Ahead of him, 2 passengers moved off the plane. Polite goodbyes, more laughter. One of them clapped Jordan on the shoulder and said, "Always a pleasure." She laughed, too hard maybe, and thanked him by name. Then her eyes met Avery's, just for a breath. He nodded once. No smile, no hostility. Just a look that said, "I'm still here. I never left. And now you know it." She opened her mouth slightly as if to say something, but he was already past her. He walked through the jet bridge, into the terminal, where the glass windows reflected the nighttime glow of the city. A row of waiting staff stood near the private arrivals exit, 2 in suits holding tablets. One of them looked up, eyes wide, and stepped forward. "Mr. Knox," the man said with a slight bow, "we're here to escort you to the executive car. It's ready. There's been a slight update from the airline's corporate team. They've asked for a few minutes of your time in the arrivals lounge." Avery didn't stop walking. "Of course," he said quietly. He knew what was happening now. The wheels were already turning. Not just the ones under the plane, but the invisible ones within the airline's internal system. Naomi's message had come through while the plane was taxiing. Submission acknowledged. Airline CEO looped. Emergency protocol engaged. Crew of Flight 332 will be held at Secure Gate for ethics review. Internal memo dispatch in progress. Meeting requested. He hadn't asked for a meeting. That wasn't his style. But the system was reacting because it had finally realized who had been sitting in 2A. The hallway led to a quiet corner of the terminal, where a polished glass door opened into a small private lounge reserved for corporate partners and senior VIPs. Inside, the lights were warmer, softer. There was no announcement here, no overhead messages about baggage claims or taxi queues. Only 3 people waited for him. One, a woman in a slate gray suit with an ID badge that read, Compliance Director, West Region. Her posture was tight, her mouth set, the kind of expression that said she had been asked to fix something she hadn't seen coming. Another, younger, nervous, holding a tablet, likely someone from legal, his eyes flickering between his notes and Avery's face. The third, a tall man in a navy blue suit, looked different, slower, more deliberate. His badge read Regional Operations, SFO Hub. He stepped forward first, hand extended. "Mr. Knox," he began, his voice steady but overly formal. "We want to extend our sincerest—" Avery didn't take his hand. He didn't speak yet either. He let the moment sit. He looked at each of them, then slowly placed his carry-on beside his chair and took a seat. Calm, straight-backed, not performing, not negotiating, just waiting. The compliance director cleared her throat. "We've been notified of the flag placed earlier this evening. Our systems have received the trace. It was detailed, very detailed. We've seen the service patterns from the flight, the time-stamped data, the behavioral logs, and, frankly, Mr. Knox," she paused, "we are taking this extremely seriously." Avery nodded once. "As you should." The legal assistant shifted. "We've already requested the full internal review. The crew will be debriefed before their next assignment is released. There's been past inconsistencies on record, and with your permission we'd like to issue a formal apology and begin compliance retraining immediately." Avery studied them. He wasn't here for their shame. He was here for their memory. Retraining won't matter, he said evenly, if you don't remember why it's needed. The room went quiet. Outside, through the wide glass wall, he could see the runway stretching into the dark. Planes landing, planes taking off. The world kept moving. But inside this room, everything had finally stopped long enough for someone to see what they usually looked past. Avery stood. He picked up his bag again, slung it over his shoulder, and paused at the door. No press release. No drama, he said. Fix it quietly, the way it was broken. He walked out without waiting for an answer. And behind him, 3 executives stood still. Not because he had raised his voice, but because he hadn't needed to. The storm had already passed through. All that remained now was the silence it left behind, and the question of who would dare forget what Seat 2A had made them see. The car waiting outside was sleek and dark, its headlights casting a soft glow across the curb. Avery Knox stepped into the back seat without a word, and the driver, a composed woman in a gray uniform, nodded respectfully before pulling away from the terminal. The silence inside the vehicle was thick, padded by leather and the quiet hum of electric motion. City lights flashed across the tinted windows, signs, shadows, blurred outlines of late-night commuters and traffic lights blinking through the fog. San Francisco moved around them, indifferent. But inside the car, Avery's mind stayed fixed on the hours behind him. He didn't replay every moment. He didn't need to. The flight had left a distinct imprint, not because of the meal, not because of the sandwich that had gone untouched for hours, but because of how practiced it had all been. The way the crew had worked around him, not with hostility but with distance, polished, routine distance, and how easily everyone else accepted it. That was the part that settled deepest. It was never just about the one person who delivered the slight. It was about the others who stood by and made room for it, who kept the wine flowing for the next row, who chuckled at the jokes in row 3, who thanked the crew and walked past him without ever wondering why his tray had been different, why no one had asked if he wanted anything else, why he, a Diamond Elite, hadn't been called by name once. He had watched it all, measured it in real time. And the worst part, the part that still echoed, was how unsurprising it had felt. The car turned left onto Market Street. The skyline opened up ahead, tall buildings cloaked in low clouds, lit from beneath like monuments. Avery glanced at the dashboard display. Nearly midnight. He would check into the hotel, reply to a few emails, sleep briefly. In the morning, there was a breakfast roundtable with federal defense advisors. But for now, there was only the stillness of aftermath. His phone buzzed softly beside him. He glanced down. A message from Naomi. Compliance trace confirmed by airline legal. Jordan Hale placed on administrative review pending investigation. 2 additional crew members flagged for passive neglect based on timestamp data. No pushback so far. All records preserved. Avery stared at the message. No expression, no satisfaction. This wasn't about punishment. He hadn't set anything in motion to teach a lesson to one person. He didn't need to prove anything to Jordan Hale. What he needed, what he had always needed, was the system to see itself, to look in the mirror it had avoided for too long. This time it didn't have a choice. Another message came in, this one unexpected. We've been asked by Stratus HQ if you would be willing to consult on their internal service equity initiative. Optional, of course. They're asking carefully, no PR language. Just a quiet request. He stared at the screen, thumb hovering over it before setting the phone down again. He leaned back into the seat and let his head rest lightly against the support. He didn't want to be their face of change. He didn't want to sit in a room full of executives who would nod and scribble notes and whisper afterward about how gracefully he handled the situation. What he wanted was for them to remember. Not just the data, not just the complaint. The stillness, the cold tray, the silence in aisle 2. The man who didn't need to shout. The car glided through a tunnel. The light inside flickered briefly, washing his face in shifting tones. White, gold, blue, before settling again. He closed his eyes for a moment. Behind them, in a terminal somewhere across the city, there were likely quiet conversations happening already. HR reports being downloaded, footage being reviewed, names being highlighted in red. Internal systems that had long operated without question were now under a kind of quiet pressure they weren't used to, and the ones who had never seen it before would now be forced to. When the car pulled into the private entrance of the hotel, a bellman appeared immediately, opening the door before Avery even reached for the handle. "Good evening, Mr. Knox," he said, polite, efficient. "Your suite is ready. Let us know if there's anything at all we can do for you tonight." Avery stepped out slowly, taking in the cool air. It was quieter here, tucked away from the street. He turned briefly to the driver before walking off. "Thank you," he said, not as habit, but because she had done her job without pretense. He entered the hotel, nodded to the receptionist, bypassed check-in, and rode the elevator alone to the top floor. When he reached his suite, he didn't turn on the lights right away. He walked to the window and stood there looking out over the city, his reflection faint in the glass. The sandwich was gone. The flight was over. The trace had been submitted. But the weight of it all, the years, the patterns, the rehearsed dismissals, it didn't leave that easily. Still, he knew something had shifted, not in him, in them. And the next time a man like him sat in seat 2A, they would think twice. Not because he raised his voice, but because he didn't have to. The hotel suite was quiet in the way only expensive rooms could be, soundproofed from the world, still as water before a storm. Avery Knox stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his hands resting in the pockets of his tailored slacks, shoulders gently sloped. The city beneath him blinked with scattered lights. Distant cars moved like ants in glass. Above, the fog thickened, that low, rolling San Francisco kind that swallowed streetlights and made the skyline feel like it was being erased 1 inch at a time. He didn't move for a long while. Behind him, the room remained untouched. No briefcase opened, no jacket removed. The temperature held steady as though the walls were waiting for him to decide what kind of night this would become. He didn't reach for a drink. He didn't sit down. He was thinking. And not about the airline, not anymore. He was thinking about how often a man like him had stood in rooms like this, luxury hotels, VIP lounges, glass-walled boardrooms, and still felt the edge of something sharp just beneath the surface. Not because he wasn't welcome, but because he was tolerated, like a guest who had been let in through the wrong door and managed to stay long enough for people to get used to it. He'd always been measured differently. When he was young, he thought excellence would erase it. If he worked harder, dressed better, spoke more carefully, the treatment would change. And it did, superficially, on paper, in introductions, but not in moments like today. Not when a flight attendant chose who to smile at. Not when his name vanished from a service log. Not when a cold sandwich was placed in front of him while others were served filet and champagne. It wasn't about her. It was never just about her. It was about the 1,000 tiny choices that built a message. That told him, you may be powerful, but we still won't see you. He turned slowly from the window and walked to the desk. His tablet was still in his hand. He set it down gently, then opened the small leather folder left by the hotel staff. Inside was a welcome card, handwritten, neat cursive. "We're honored to host you, Mr. Knox. Let us know if you need anything at all. Javier, guest services." It was a small thing. Polite, kind. But Avery couldn't help feeling the contrast. Javier, a man he'd never met, had addressed him by name, offered assistance without hesitation, and made his presence feel acknowledged. Jordan, who had stood just inches from him for hours, had treated him like an unbooked seat, like an anomaly she couldn't categorize, so she simply chose to exclude. He picked up the pen from the folder, clicked it once, then put it down again. There was no note to leave tonight, nothing left to record here. He walked toward the bathroom, shedding his jacket as he went, folding it over the back of the velvet chair. When he looked at himself in the mirror, he didn't see fatigue. He saw clarity, not the firebrand kind, not rage. Just that deep, unshakable certainty that comes when a line has been crossed one too many times. He began to wash his face. the warm water a quiet relief. As he dried off, he caught sight of the small airline amenity pouch resting beside the sink, the airline's logo printed in silver thread, something they gave to all Diamond passengers. He picked it up. It was unopened. He turned it over in his hand, felt the smooth fabric, unzipped it. Inside, everything was arranged in perfect order. Socks, sleep mask, toothpaste, lotion, all untouched, all pristine. But there it was again, a single card tucked inside the flap. "We appreciate your continued loyalty, Mr. Knox. Your status means the world to us." He stared at it, then exhaled a short breath through his nose. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. Loyalty. He placed the pouch back where he found it and left it unzipped. That word, loyalty, had always come with an asterisk. What it really meant was, so long as you don't ask too much, so long as you don't point out what we've grown used to ignoring. But tonight, Avery had asked. Not loudly, not rudely. He had simply said, "I see it, and I won't let it pass again." And now, someone somewhere was sitting at a desk, maybe Jordan, maybe her supervisor, maybe someone in corporate risk, sifting through logs and footage, reading over timestamps and flagged comments, realizing the name in seat 2A hadn't been an ordinary traveler. It had been someone who noticed everything, and someone who would not walk away quietly again. Avery dimmed the lights in the suite, letting the city fade back into shadow. He walked to the bedroom, his steps steady, unhurried. Tomorrow would come quickly. Emails, meetings, policy talk, a new room full of men with firm handshakes and carefully phrased respect. But tonight was his. The silence, the memory of cold water on his fingers, and the certainty that next time, if there was a next time, the system would think twice before assuming the man in 2A would stay invisible. The morning came quietly, no alarm, no knock, just the slow widening of light across the floor of the suite as the sun broke through San Francisco's heavy fog. Avery Knox lay awake, not still from sleep, but from reflection. His eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling, watching the soft shadows shift as the world outside began to move again. Another day, another city, another high-rise skyline, another executive meeting, another seat at a polished table where his voice would be heard, but only after it was measured. He had lived a life in these spaces, boardrooms, conferences, summit panels, mastering the art of being both undeniable and quietly undermined. He had made peace with the paradox. But peace didn't mean acceptance, and last night had reminded him why. He rose slowly and dressed with precision, as he always did. Crisp white shirt, pressed slacks, cufflinks with a matte black finish. Every detail said control. Every line of his suit whispered, "I earned this, and I never let anyone take it from me." By the time he entered the hotel's private lounge for breakfast, the room was mostly empty. A few early travelers sipped espresso and typed on laptops. The air was filled with soft piano music, synthetic, tuned to sound like relaxation. Avery took a seat by the window. A waiter approached, young, polite, eyes alert. "Good morning, Mr. Knox," he said. "Can I get you your usual this morning, or would you like to see the menu?" Avery didn't flinch. "My usual's fine," he said. "Thank you." The waiter left. Just like that, he had been remembered. It shouldn't have felt remarkable, but it did. He sat there for a moment, breathing in the quiet, thinking not about the breakfast but about everything that had led him to this moment of recognition. The fight it took. The restraint. The silence he had turned into strategy. His tablet buzzed beside him on the table. A notification lit up the screen. Naomi again. Stratus has begun internal review procedures. Jordan Hale removed from active roster pending final decision. Internal memo titled Guest Equity and Behavioral Expectations distributed company-wide this morning. CEO has requested closed-door consultation with you next quarter. No public statements planned. Avery tapped the screen once to clear the message, then turned it face down. This was enough. There would be no press conference, no headlines, no viral hashtag with his name. That wasn't what he needed, because the goal was never spectacle. It was correction. It was memory. It was about forcing the system to see what it had trained itself to ignore. The waiter returned and set his tray down with practiced grace. Eggs, sliced avocado, perfectly toasted sourdough, and a small dish of berries on the side. Fresh coffee. Linen napkin. Silverware placed with care. "Let me know if you need anything else, Mr. Knox," the waiter said, then paused. "And, for what it's worth, I saw the report this morning, the one that went around corporate. About Flight 332, Avery didn't answer. He just raised his eyes." The waiter hesitated, then spoke again. Lower now, more personal. "Some of us do notice. We just don't always know what to do. But, thank you for not letting it slide." He left before Avery could reply, and Avery didn't chase the moment. He simply sat with it. Outside the window, the fog had begun to lift, not all at once, just in pieces. Little breaks of blue emerging behind the gray. It was how change always arrived. Uneven, slow, almost invisible at first. He took a sip of his coffee. It was strong, bitter. Exactly how he liked it. He thought of Jordan Hale wherever she was now, probably being escorted into an internal office, her face composed, her voice rehearsed. Maybe she would deny. Maybe she would explain. Maybe she would sit with the realization that the man she had looked past had been watching her the entire time. Not with anger, but with precision. He wondered if she'd remember his words at the end of the flight. "No, I've already received everything I needed." At the time, she probably hadn't understood. But maybe now, in a quiet room with a supervisor and a printout of time-stamped service data, she did. Avery looked back down at his plate. The toast had cooled slightly. He picked up his fork, took one slow bite, then another. He didn't need validation. He didn't need recognition. What he needed, and what he had achieved, was something deeper. He had changed the story without ever raising his voice. He had proven that silence, when paired with purpose, could shake the walls louder than shouting ever could. And as he sat in the soft light of morning, looking out over a city that had so often been blind to men like him, Avery Knox knew that from this point on, whether in the skies, the boardroom, or a seat labeled 2A, he would never be unseen again. And neither would the ones who came after him. If this story moved you, please give it a like. Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this one.